My name is Joel Alex, and today we'll understand the concept of castling. Castling is when we move the king from the center using the rook. Uh, I'll give an example of what castling is. There are primarily two types of castling, which is called the queen side, right? Which is called the long castling, and there's also something called the king's castling, which is considered the shorter side, right? Castling, let me show you an example of what castling is, right? This is called castling, right? Castling is when we essentially move the king from the center. It's really beneficial to try and move your king away from the center. That's because there's a lesser probability of, anyone trying to attack you. I mean, over here, obviously, a king is not safe, so it would probably be safer to do a queen side castling, right? There's a general checklist that we follow before even castling, right? There, I have a document open for that, right? You can only castle if your king has never moved, right? What does that mean? Uh, what that means is, uh, let me show you an example. Let's say, for example, hypothetically, right? Let's say the king was checked, right? And because of that, the king had to move once, right? Let's take a look at it, right? So this is a check, right? And so now I have to move my king. Because the king has moved, I lose my right to castle. If you take a look, I cannot castle any longer. So that's what this line means. If the king has never moved, uh, you can castle, right? That's a legal move. Next up, we have a case where the rook has never moved, right? Let's take an example for that too, right? Let's say, for example, the rook moved, right? Hypothetically. Um, what happens is that we cannot castle uh, the king side, right? Why can't we castle along the king side? That's simply because this rook, which was on h1, has moved, right? But we can castle along the queen side because this rook on a1 hasn't moved. Let me show you, right? So that means we can castle now, but they're only on one side because that rook on a1 didn't move, right? Let's move on to the next point. There are no pieces in between, right? If you'll take a look, there are no pieces between the king and the rook. Let me show an example of where castling wouldn't be allowed uh, if we had a piece in between, right? So let's say, for example, we had the queen in between and we had one of the pieces in between, right? So what happens is that since there's no clear path between the rook and the king, what happens is that we are unable to move, right? So how exactly would we castle over here? We would have to create space, right? So what this would do is we'll be able to um, castle, right? And that's simply because we have space now, right? And because there's a clear path between the king and the rook, right? So that's how we can castle. That's exactly what third point talks about. Uh, Next point comes the whole checkpoint. I mean, this we saw a case like this, right, where the bishop came and checked us, right? Let's just take a look at that. Let's say, for example, all right, uh, let's even remove the queen, honestly. Let's say this wasn't there, and this was here. I will keep this here, all right. If you'll notice, when we play the actual game, right, we cannot castle. We don't get that option. Why don't we get that option? Because we're currently under check, right? Because we're under check, we'll have to move, right? Either we would have to move or we would have to defend it, but in this case, we can't really defend it. The next thing you notice is, wait, I'll actually get to that point in a bit, right? Yeah, this part. It's this point, right? The king's destination needs to be safe. King's destination and king's path, right? Uh, what does that mean? Let's take a look into the king's path square actually, because this is more relatable right now. Uh, let's say hypothetically, right? This was there, right? There was a pawn on f2. You notice we're not under any sort of check, right? But what you'll notice is we are unable to castle. Why are we unable to castle? Because although this path is uh, free, right? Both the paths are free. But you notice that the queen prevents us from castling. Why does the queen prevent us from castling? Well, that's simply because if we were to castle, right, hypothetically, right, which we can't obviously right now, we would immediately come under check, and that's not allowed, right? That violates the very first, very the rule above it, which says that we cannot be under check, right? So that's exactly why you can't castle, and that's exactly what this point talks about. The king's path needs to be safe. Next, the next thing we notice is the king's destination needs to be safe, right? So what does that mean? I'll show you that example. Give me a minute.